Welcome to another episode of Decode. When was the last time that you landed into a city and you thought, this place looks unique? Not because of Zara, not because of Starbucks or the same Instagram-ready coffee shops. I mean a place where the streets, the colors, the smells, the voices, or even the rhythm of life felt different. It surprised you. In this day and age, we could take a flight and be in a few hours in Seoul, in Dubai, New York, Istanbul, and end up literally in the same shops, listening to the same music, with the same brands, staying on similar Airbnbs. You see, we were promised infinite variety, but somehow everybody's living the same life. Why? Because we are no longer choosing. The data chooses for you. This phenomenon is called the illusion of choice. Think about this. Amazon, for example, stocks millions of products. Netflix, thousands of shows. Spotify maybe stores hundreds of millions of tracks. But this range does not bring us freedom. It brings us the illusion of choosing from what they put in front of us. Let me give you an example. Let's say you search for headphones on Amazon, to listen to music. You know what? Maybe there's 43,000 results. Sure, a huge range, right? Will you look at them? No, most likely there's so many that you will pick from page 1 just because it's stressing for you to see all that variety. So you didn't pick the best, you picked the easiest, because in this case, variety brought laziness and we have resistance to examine all the options, and then we go with the easier one. This is called the paradox of choice, which means that for more options, we actually have less satisfaction. There's a famous study by Iyengar and Lepper, Columbia University, in the year 2000. They set up a jam tasting booth, to taste different tastes of jam, like jelly and, marmalade and stuff, right? And then they did two tests, and it's really, really funny, you'll see. In one test, they brought 24 different flavors of jam so that people could choose from. Okay, that was test number 1, 24 flavors. And the other one was just 6 flavors of jam, to choose from. So one had a lot of variety and the other one has way less variety. Okay, on the test number 1, which had 24 tastes, flavors of jam to choose from, only 3% in the end ended up buying a jar of jam, 3%, okay? Then on the other one, where they had only 6 flavors of jam, 30%, so that's 10 times more, people actually in the end bought a package of jam. You see, the idea is that sometimes fewer options bring more actions, because if we have too many options beyond a certain saturation point, we just go on autopilot and we choose the easiest one because our brain does not want to scan so many options. In this case, for example, if I give you 24 tastes of jam to choose from, most likely you'll say, let's get strawberry because it's the easy choice, right? So basically, in these cases, our brain tends to take shortcuts, like, bestseller, trending now. We're not choosing. What we're doing is minimizing the expenditure of energy. We don't want to spend energy, so we go with the easy choice, with the one people are buying, the one that's popular, the one that's number 1. Let me give you another example. Now we're going to move from Amazon to Netflix. Basically, I'm sure you're aware of this, but most viewing actually on Netflix and similar streaming platforms does not come from the huge range that they store, but actually from the result at the top rows of the homepage, because people are exhausted after 5 minutes of scanning for content. This happens to me a lot. When I try to find something on Netflix with my wife, many times, honestly, we switch Netflix off and we go watch TV because we don't want to think about all the million options that Netflix gives us. There's actually a study, in this case, it was done for Netflix in research in 2015. And basically what they found out is that 80% of what people watch on Netflix comes from the recommendations, not from active search. So in other words, in Netflix you can search for something specific, right? Maybe you want to see a Japanese reality show, so to say. People will not do that. People will stop exploring and they will just click on whatever has been served because the algorithm chose for them. And so it's not so much a catalog, it becomes like a tunnel. You are entering the tunnel and you go in a straight line towards the content that you're being fed. Again, as I was saying before, a little bit like cattle, And the tunnel will always bring something familiar, something unsurprising. Many times you'll find content on Netflix, if you search a bit, that's actually very appealing to you, but that takes effort that we're not willing to spend on this kind of decision. It's not uniqueness, it's basically mass standardization disguised as personalization. You feel, oh yeah, I can choose among many options. No, what's going to happen is that you will end up watching Stranger Things like everybody else, or The Samurai Turned Pretty, or whatever TV show is on trend at this point. And the fraud here is that we think we're making choices, but in reality, we're just confirming what has been already chosen for us by the algorithm. Let's move on to Spotify. Again, the third example, but it's actually more of the same. Let me give you some data that's actually scary. If you are like me, a fan of music, I love music, and I love old music where songs could be, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, like Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd or The Cure. This kind of bands who could do, long pieces of music. Okay, let me show you some data. In the 90s, so before the Spotify era, the average song in the market lasted around 4 minutes. 4 minutes, okay? Today, there's a Spotify phenomenon which makes songs last about 2.5 minutes. So, the length of the duration of the songs has almost halved in the matter of, 30 years. Why? Because you need to understand how Spotify works. Spotify basically generates revenue for the artist by number of plays, So if you generate more plays, you get more money. Not so much for minutes of play, but for unique plays. So if you're rewarded by plays, of course, shorter songs lead to more plays. And so artists in general are making songs shorter and shorter and shorter, and also simpler at the same time. So cut straight to the chorus because we want to be done with this in about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, because again, that will generate more money. There was a study by Hubert Levillier, 2017, in a magazine called the Science of Music, and he analyzed the Billboard hits and found that basically the intros, so the non-singing part, basically, of the song are shrinking. The songs actually, they cut to the hook much faster, because if not, we have become so impatient that we skip. We give the song 10 seconds, unless there's a hook, unless we have our dopamine shot or instant satisfaction, we move on. And that generates songs which are shorter, and of course that means less variety, and it means a more planar experience. The reality is that if you are a fan of music like I am, the other day, for example, preparing this video, I was listening to trending songs, trending songs from modern artists. I don't want to sound like a boomer, but the reality is I listened about 30 trending songs in a row, and honestly, I cannot remember a single one of them. They were just basically wallpaper. They were like a texture. Sure, it's pleasant, but it's empty. You don't feel like there's something that you should remember or something memorable about any of those tracks. Same thing if we look at Hollywood. Between 2005 and 2014, only 39% of the top grossing films are original. All the rest are based on existing franchises. Again, same idea, lower risk, higher predictability, and that's the logic of the algorithm. The algorithm, because it wants to put in front of you something that you're going to like, of course, the only way for him to know what you're going to like is to examine your past behavior. And so that means that he's going to basically reinforce your current behavior, and not so only your behavior, but the behavior of the mass. If the algorithm knows that something is popular, you're going to be force-fed that thing, even though maybe it's not for you, or maybe it's not 100% original or satisfactory. This is a phenomenon that's actually my word. I call this the reinforcement of the dominant behavior. Let me tell you how this works. Let's say on Netflix, 70% of the people are enjoying something. For the sake of example, let's say the new season of Stranger Things. Stranger Things is popular, you put out a new season, 70% of the people are actually enjoying that, right? Then what's going to happen is that the algorithm is going to push that season to 100% of the audience. Not because it's best, but because it's a safe bet. Like, oh, it's 70% of the people are enjoying this, most likely you can be force-fed this and you can find it satisfactory, So by doing this, by this reinforcement of the dominant behavior, what happens is an exercise of optimization that generates flattening, Culture, it's turning from a landscape, hills and valleys and different tastes and different biomes and that kind of stuff, to a plain. We're all watching the same, we're all listening to the same, we're all reading the same, we're just going by the flavor of the month because of a mixture of us being lazy and the algorithms actually pushing always the same stuff because it's the stuff that actually does work. And it's actually going to get worse with AI because if you think about it, generative AI is going to accelerate this cycle because that's the algorithm taken to the extreme. When you look at, for example, people now crafting music with AI, of course, what it's doing, it's examining patterns from the past and it's actually rehashing those patterns to generate new music. But let's face it, the key word here is rehash. Same thing with, generative image systems or videos and that kind of stuff. There's another study, 2023, this one is more recent by McKenzie et al. And they tested people with AI-generated versus human-generated art. They showed people AI-generated art, human-generated art, and actually the majority of the viewers qualified the AI work as derivative. Sure, it's safe, it's average, it's predictable. It's hard to find a disruption by using AI. Think, for example, about Picasso, the famous painter, or think about, any disruptive musical band that actually broke new ground. Let's say Johnny Cash in the day, let's say Rammstein more recently. Could an AI invent that? No, because what an AI does is it does a median, an average of the existing content, and it generates new content, but that content is based on the old one, so it does not have the ability to see something new that no one has seen before. It's going to generate a derivative work. And so the result of that is that actually originality and creativity is becoming, in the era of AI, a system error. And we'll listen to music that sounds very much like manufactured music, and then basically we tend to only look at the artist in terms of, oh yeah, this band is cool because of their fashion or because of the style, but not about the music, because music all sounds the same, and the same happens with movies, and the same happens with content all over the world. But it's not only about the media industries. This is happening in other industries as well. This idea of a more boring world. It seems like aesthetics, the aesthetics of the production of aesthetics by humans is kind of like becoming more predictable. Let me share some data with you. Okay. If you look at the 1960s, and if you look at the parking lot, it will look like a rainbow, right? Basically, you will have blues and yellows and silvers and greens and pistachios and pinks and all sorts of colors of the rainbow in our cars, right? Today, 80% of the cars sold last year were desaturated colors, so either black, gray, white, or silver. And that's a fact. That's something happening. And you don't need to take my word for it. Just look through the window, look at the cars, and remember when you were younger. Is it true or not that basically cars now are more single color than they used to be back in the day? Why? Year after year, it seems like neutral tones dominate because automakers, they want to play safe. They want something that you don't get bored with. They want something that appeals to more people. They've done studies, as I was saying before, the algorithm, and they know that those colors are popular. So again, as I was saying, because 70% of the people want a more safe car, the other 30% of the people, they cannot buy a pink car, they cannot buy a turquoise car, or they cannot buy a pistachio car just because they would feel kind of like outside of the norm that we are all establishing in this more boring world that we're collectively creating. Same thing happens with fast fashion. If you look at any fast fashion chains, I spoke about Zara before. I could talk about H&M, Primark, any of those. Basically, what they do is they have a cycle so fast that they can detect a trend. This has been proven once and again, that these companies, they do not invent trends. What they do is they have a lot of scouts, and whenever they see a trend, it could be on TikTok, it could be in the streets, it could be anything, they're able to churn out a collection so fast. In some cases of this fast fashion brands, we're talking about a turnaround time, and I'm not joking, of between 2 and 3 weeks from the moment they spot the trend to the moment they have the collection in the stores. So maybe this year the fashion trend is a beige sweater. They are able to churn out that same beige sweater in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. And then what happens is that because this turnaround time is so quick, they can pretend they created this trend when they didn't. They just copied something they saw and they thought it was appealing. But the reality is that, sure, you have a trend. Maybe they saw this sweater that I was talking about in Tokyo by a kid wearing it, and then all of a sudden they manufacture 10 million of them. And then the world becomes more flat because what was original is now mass-produced, manufactured, and delivered to your door in a matter of 3 weeks. Same thing with Pinterest, for example. Pinterest is a great flattener of culture because people see things on Pinterest and everybody wants the same thing. Look at those TV shows which are about house reformations, right? They transform a house. Everybody wants the same stuff. Everybody wants a kitchen with a big island. Everybody wants French doors. Everybody wants yada, 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 because we are all repeating the same trend. If you look at the past, again, as I was doing before, think about the artists from the past. Think about Gaudi. Gaudi is a Spanish architect from my country. So look at the artwork of Gaudi. Was he copying anyone? Well, yeah, he was copying nature. And that's what he was doing. He was saying, I am inspired by nature. Do you see that kind of thinking in the modern world? Nope. Now we do boxes. Our buildings are boxes made of glass and in a very dull tone, because that's kind of like, pleasing for basically everybody. Looking for return of investment, right? Let's build it cheap so that, we can move on to build something boring right afterwards. And it's not just algorithms. I'm saying part of the blame of this is algorithms because they make some trends dominate, but it's not only algorithms, it's also about economics of scale in this case. When a company manages to break through and become global, that company becomes a little bit like an atomic bomb. You imagine a bomb being dropped, right? It's going to generate a wasteland around it, right? So whenever one of these huge companies actually breaks through and becomes dominant, the problem is that it erases the opportunity for any local makers who actually foster this originality that I was talking about. Let's take an example, okay? I don't want to blame this company in particular because I could say the same thing with many other companies, But the example I'm going to use today is the Swedish furniture manufacturer IKEA, okay? So IKEA, when I was young here in Spain, we had a thriving furniture industry. Specifically in my region, there was a lot of people actually building furniture, It could be like more, let's say, ancient style furniture. It could be modern furniture. It could be wicker furniture. There was 1 million types of furniture manufactured in Spain and sold all over the country. Okay, what is left of that industry? Nothing. Literally nothing. Why? Because you have an IKEA. Anywhere you're in Spain, there's going to be an IKEA, let's say 20, 30 kilometers away from you. An IKEA is cheap and it's convenient. And so by scaling globally, basically IKEA has vaporized the opportunity for a lot of local makers who they just can't compete. Because if you think about a family-owned business building furniture in Spain in the 1980s, of course they cannot compete with a Swedish superpower that has offices in most countries of the world. You see, the idea, there's another study here in a magazine called Economic Geography 2008 by Tocatli. Basically, it says that fast fashion brands like Zara in this example, they restructure local industries because they force suppliers worldwide into the same low margin, high speed model. And of course, the local manufacturers, they cannot compete with this. Who can try to create a fashion brand in Spain in this day and age, when you know that whatever you put out, Zara is going to do the same much faster in a much bigger scale, and is going to be able to sell it worldwide. So it's going to make your competition basically impossible, right? So what we're cultivating is not a culture of variety. What we're cultivating is an economic monoculture, a wasteland where alternative, they just cannot survive. So it's not only the algorithm pushing the same content, it's also the economics of scale actually putting people out of business and generating kind of like a lifeless wasteland outside of these major companies that are making the world more flat in terms of our production of culture, of products and services. And globalization is basically thus kind of like a false promise, I remember when I was younger, in the 80s and 90s, we thought, oh yeah, sure, now we're going to be part of the EU, and then you'll have many more products and many more this and many more that, yada, 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 right? Okay, think about this. There's around 200 countries in the world, 200 countries, okay? So I want you to forget the ones that basically are too poor to be able to afford any of this. Most of Africa, for example, some countries in Asia. But think about this, 200 countries, right? As I said, okay, there's a Starbucks in 86 countries. There's an H&M in 75 countries. Netflix is available in 190 countries. Spotify is available in 184 countries. So again, you can fly 10,000 kilometers and still be here, because you're going to encounter the same Airbnbs, the same Zaras, the same Starbucks, the same Stranger Things, the same whatever. Globalization promised to build bridges between cultures so that we could enjoy different cultures. The reality is that it destroyed those local cultures by building a global supermarket for the same brands. And that's, in a way, very ridiculous to me. For example, I'm from Barcelona, Spain, right? And then if you go to the main avenue here in Barcelona, you're going to encounter shops by Louis Vuitton, for example, or by, Prada, or by Valentino, or by any of those fast fashion brands I was talking about, like Zara, etc. But they're the same everywhere. For example, a person from France coming from France to Spain, why should they be interested in going to Louis Vuitton if it's a French brand? The same way, why are we as Spanish people actually going to Zara in Tokyo? You see what I mean? It's really absurd. I would love to go to Tokyo to actually enjoy local stuff, not the same stuff I can find in my home. So basically, unless you go to a really different countries. So, for example, now I'm enjoying the luxury that I'm working in India. I'm working in Mumbai for a company there as a consultant. Unless you go to a country like this, which still retains part of its uniqueness, and that's what makes it cool, what you're going to encounter is one culture, everywhere for everyone, and basically it's very hard for you not to be inside that loop, because it flattens culture, it flattens economies, and countries just become showrooms for the same few brands. Think about this. When was the last time that you bought something like clothing that did not belong to a global brand? Come on, think about it. It could be, again, as I said, H&M, it could be Nike, it could be Levi. But, when was the last time that you bought something of clothing that is from a country that only exists in your country, from a brand that only exists in your country? Most likely many years ago, right? There's a study by Peterson that showed that how globalization actually, which was a promise of diversity, actually what it does, it produces this kind of like hybrid identity that at the consumer level, sure, we all feel the richness and the variety of the products, but we all default to the sameness and not diversity actually. So again, we didn't give access to the world, we flattened the world so that world that was rich and interesting is actually less rich and less interesting than it was something like 20, 30 years ago. And then you'll ask yourself, sure, yeah, and so what? Yeah, well, we made the world more flat, and so what? Well, you need to understand that basically diversity is not just decoration, diversity is the building block of culture. To generate culture and to generate progress, we do need diversity. If thinking becomes repetition, if everything is the same and novelty disappears, our brain is basically in a more poor scenario. There's a neuroscience report on 2006 that shows that, of course, dopamine, the neurotransmitter of dopamine, spikes when the brain encounters novelty, right? So predictability yields less dopamine, less motivation to do stuff, because dopamine is actually a neurotransmitter that generates our need to do stuff, So again, a dull environment, what it does is actually it decreases our activation level. That's the reason why, for example, people who spend long times in prison, serving time, actually they lower their activity level, because the lack of novelty leads them to live a more boring life, and that's the same thing happening to us. The only difference is that we're living in a prison which is in an open space, which is the whole world. But the lack of variety is actually hampering our ability to be more active. There was another study on magazine Psychological Science that actually said that walks in very natural environments improve memory, mood, far more than walks in monotonous urban walks. That's something I've explained in previous videos here in the channel. But basically, they took two groups, kind of like a test group and then a control group. And then the test group, they took them to a forest, and basically they had them walking in a forest for 1 hour. And they had kind of like a different group actually on a city, walking on the city. And then right after that, they did a memory test, a memory test to see which one was having better memory. And the one had been at the forest had better memory and also reported better mood after the walk than the one had been in the city. And there's a scientific reason for that, which is in nature, we know it lowers our levels of cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone responsible for stress, and then when we are in the city, especially with noise and crowds, actually our cortisol level goes up, and of course that basically affects our mood, and because our mood is affected, our memory is affected as well, So again, a more flat world is a worse world for our mental well-being. So here in my channel, I always try to give like an optimistic way forward, because of course we need to spot the issues, but at the same time we need to look into the future, ideally a healthier future, So of course, what I want you guys to understand is that a boring world is not really our fate. It's not fate. We're not forced to live in a boring world. It's a choice, because if you think about it, no time before this time has actually had more breadth and more variety of products and services. It's just that we're not choosing the right ones. We're choosing the ones that we're being force-fed by a spoon, basically, But actually, for us to go to a more interesting world, all it takes is to recover a little bit of this sense of challenge, of effort, and of discovery, which is actually our choice. So of course, try to go where it feels uneasy. If you've never been to a theater, go to a theater. If you've never been to a classical music concert, go to a classical music concert. Go to new places. All those places do exist, and we're lucky to live in a world where all this is available. Unlike before, 200 years ago, people could not dream of the variety that we enjoy today. So it's about us in our free will to actually try not to use the world in its more default setting, more boring world. Seek the local, the imperfect, the unpopular. Train your taste. That's something, for example, I did with my kids when they were young. Of course, all kids, they only want basically nuggets and, frankfurts, And of course, we trained their taste and we said, no, this is curry, this is sushi, this is veggies. We try to train them to enjoy the strange, the difficult things in food. Support originals, creators. Try to buy from people who create because it's their impulse, not so much because of an ROI, return on investment system. Try to support creators who do things because it's their passion. Speak for yourself. Don't post what feeds the feed. Say what's real. Say what's inside of you. And of course, reclaim the habits of the real. Cook, walk, draw, laugh off camera, look at the sky. Originality is a risk, but that's what makes life worth living. So as a wrapper thought, imagine you enter a room, white walls, IKEA poster, bestseller on the table, same song as yesterday. Sure, everything works, yeah, but nothing moves you. That's the boring world. It's a world optimized to death. Again, as I said before, it's an open-air prison. But you're not just a spectator, Your choice is what's going to build tomorrow's world. The world became boring not because it ran out of energy or of alternatives. No, it became boring because algorithms reinforced the dominant behavior and global giants deleted the alternatives. But in a nutshell, it became boring because we allowed it to become boring. We can still reclaim our sense of wonder, not for everyone, but for yourself. Each one of us is unique and different, so try to find what works for you, not what the algorithm is force-feeding you. Choose the strange, support the original, make the world original again. Thanks for watching. This is another episode of Decode, the podcast in which I try to talk about the modern world with no bullshit, trying to discover things which we should all be interested in. And in this case, is the world becoming more boring? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like so that I understand the kind of content that you guys enjoy. Subscribe to the channel here on Decode. I try to post a new video every Friday. So if you're here next Friday, there's going to be a new video about something else. And again, down here on the comments below, you can share your ideas how to make the world more interesting for each and every one of us. Thanks for watching. See you on the next episode of Decode.